They called them wooden coffins. And on June 6, 1944, every man climbed inside one. Before dawn, the sea looked endless and wrong. The sky over the English Channel was the color of tin and fear. You could smell it: salt, oil, diesel, and vomit. The air itself felt like metal. Rows of gray landing craft, Higgins LCVPs, bucked against the waves, each packed tight with 30 men who pretended they weren't scared. From above, the armada looked like a swarm of beetles crawling east. From inside the boats, it looked like a mistake someone had forgotten to cancel. The hulls were thin plywood bolted to a steel ramp that rattled like loose teeth. The Navy called them landing craft, vehicle, personnel. The soldiers called them something simpler: coffins. Private Jack Hutchinson, 29th Division, Iowa, held his rifle tight against his chest, as if the weapon could steady his heartbeat. Beside him, a kid from Texas stared at the floorboards, whispering the same line over and over: "We're really doing this." Someone near the stern laughed too loud, not because anything was funny, but because it wasn't. "You're kidding me," a corporal muttered. "We're crossing the channel in that." The coxswain, a Navy man who looked 50 but was probably 30, spat into the water and said, "You'll love it. Rides like a dream if you don't mind dying wet." When the engines throttled up, conversation died. The noise filled every crack of thought. Salt water slapped faces and a film of diesel-coated lips. The boats rose and fell in the dark like lungs too big for their body. Every time they dropped, someone's stomach tried to leave through their throat. A few prayed. Others made deals. A red-haired kid from Ohio scratched the name Lucy into the stock of his rifle with his bayonet. One sailor drew a cross on the bow in grease pencil. Another sketched a crude heart and laughed under his breath. There wasn't room for superstition, but it came anyway. Small, desperate, practical. At 0300, word passed from ship to ship. H-hour 0630. The men didn't cheer. They just looked at one another, as if memorizing faces in case they needed to describe them later. Hutchinson's platoon leader, Lieutenant Parker, tried a joke that came out like a confession. 3-meter waves, that's what they tell us. She's rated for that. Just don't take a bullet to the hull. Someone shouted back, "What about machine guns?" Parker didn't look up. "You pray faster." The sea grew rougher as they neared the coast. The men braced their legs and clenched their teeth. Each crash of the bow against water sounded like thunder. Sprays soaked uniforms. Rifles gleamed dark with salt. Every minute stretched. A few of the men began to hum, an unconscious rhythm against the pounding waves. At 0430, the horizon started to glow, faint and gray-green. France was still invisible, but everyone could feel it. The land pulling at them, the idea of it. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke. They were close enough now to hear artillery in the distance, low, dull, and constant. One by one, men began checking their gear again, fingers clumsy in the cold. Magazines loaded. Helmets tightened. Dog tags tucked into shirts. Somewhere a sergeant said, "Remember, boys, straight off the ramp, not sideways. You go sideways, you die. Keep moving." Nobody replied. There was nothing left to say. By 0530, the fleet had spread across the water like a gray rash. Destroyers, transports, patrol boats, an ocean made of iron. The sky was light now, streaked with smoke and tracer fire far ahead. The soldiers could see other boats pitching through the swells, black silhouettes filled with men who looked exactly like them, going to the same place for the same reason. A sailor leaned over the side and vomited, wiped his mouth, and laughed. Hell of a way to start the morning. The channel didn't care. It kept rolling, black and merciless. Every few minutes, a wave bigger than the rest would rise and drop over the bow, soaking everyone. The cold punched straight through their jackets. Someone's helmet clanged against the steel bulkhead, and no one even looked. Then the radio crackled. 5 minutes. Everything slowed. The noise of the sea dimmed until all that remained was the sound of breath. Hutchinson glanced up and caught the eyes of the coxswain. The man nodded once, just once. "You're gonna make it," he said. He didn't sound like he believed it, but the words helped anyway. The men lifted their rifles, hands shaking not from fear anymore, but from adrenaline too strong to hide. The ramp lever was wet with seawater. They could see flashes now, the coastline coming alive, muzzle fire flickering like lightning. 2 minutes, someone shouted. The boat surged forward, engines screaming. Bullets began to skip off the water like stones. The air turned sharp and hot with cordite. France was close enough to see now. A gray smear of cliffs and wire, alive with fire. Private Hutchinson closed his eyes for a heartbeat, whispered something he couldn't remember later, and gripped the rifle until his knuckles whitened. "Ramp down," the coxswain yelled. The ramp slammed into the surf, and the world exploded. The wooden coffins hit the sand, and history opened fire. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. He wasn't a general. He wasn't even a soldier. But his boat changed the war. New Orleans, 1939. The air smelled of diesel and river mud, thick with the sound of hammers and jazz. In a half-rotted warehouse near the Mississippi, a man in oil-stained khakis leaned over a wooden frame, barking orders through a cigar. Andrew Jackson Higgins, shipbuilder, troublemaker, self-taught engineer. His hands were too scarred for a businessman, his mouth too loud for a gentleman. "Hell," he told a new hire, "if you can't build it right, build it fast. We'll fix it later." The men laughed, because everyone knew he meant it. Higgins Industries wasn't like the naval yards back east. His workers were welders from the docks, fishermen from the bayou, women from the French Quarter, even a few ex-cons. They called him Andy, never sir. And he called them what they were, the only people crazy enough to build a boat no one had asked for. The Navy didn't want it. Not at first. They wanted battleships, cruisers, something with weight and glory. Not a flat-bottomed contraption made for swamp work. But Higgins saw farther than the brass in Washington. "If it floats in a swamp," he said, "it'll land on any beach in Europe." He had designed it for Louisiana, a small, shallow craft that could slide over sandbars and reeds. But the Marines who trained in the Gulf saw something else, a way to deliver men straight onto hostile shores. The problem was the ramp. Every landing craft before it forced troops to climb over the sides, easy targets. Higgins, after watching a hog being loaded into a truck, got an idea. He built a prototype with a drop-down front gate, so men could run directly out, rifles up, onto land. It was ugly. It was brilliant. In 1940, he demonstrated it for the Navy on Lake Pontchartrain. The officers stood with their hands behind their backs, unimpressed. The boat roared forward, slammed onto the sand, dropped its ramp, and a squad of Marines spilled out, dry and ready. Higgins turned to the admirals and said, "You want to fight a war, or you want to watch one?" They still said no. Too risky, too crude. So he built more anyway. He mortgaged his home, expanded his factory, and kept sending telegrams, not to admirals, but to Washington. Eventually, one reached the desk of a general named Dwight Eisenhower. The general asked for a test. Within weeks, Higgins was flying to D.C., with blueprints rolled under his arm and a grin that said he'd already won. When America entered the war, the Navy swallowed its pride. Higgins' toy became the landing craft, vehicle, personnel, the LCVP. They ordered thousands, then tens of thousands. His factories ran day and night. By 1943, his workforce had grown to 30,000, men and women welding side by side under the glare of sodium lights. The smell of burned steel and magnolia trees mixed in the Louisiana air. Every 23 minutes, another Higgins boat rolled off the line. He walked the floor constantly, never wearing a suit. He'd slap a mechanic on the back, curse a foreman, take a sip of coffee gone cold. "Speed and guts, boys. That's how we'll drown Hitler." When a reporter once asked how many boats he could deliver, Higgins replied, "As many as they can shoot at." The government gave him awards, medals, contracts. He didn't hang any of them. Instead, he pinned a note above his desk. "We are building the road to Europe." In 1944, the first real test came. His boats, those same plywood boxes the Navy had laughed at, carried the first wave of soldiers onto Tarawa, Sicily, and Salerno. Then came the word that changed everything: Normandy. Eisenhower himself would later say, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us." If Higgins had not designed and built those boats, we never could have landed over an open beach. But Higgins didn't hear that yet. On June 6, 1944, he stood in his office above the Mississippi docks, listening to the radio crackle with news from across the ocean. The broadcast was broken by static and fear. He poured whiskey into a chipped mug and stared out the window at the night workers, welding, hammering, shouting over the noise. They were still building boats. Thousands of them. Each one a small coffin of plywood and hope. He raised the mug in a private toast and whispered to no one. "Don't sink, boys. Just get them there." Outside, a whistle blew. Another LCVP slid into the water, its number stenciled in white on the gray hull. The current took it slowly downriver, toward the Gulf, toward a war waiting across the world. And somewhere in the darkness, on a storm-thrashed sea, those boats were already opening their ramps, delivering men not to safety, but to history. Because sometimes the heroes don't storm the beaches. Sometimes they build the boats that make it possible. At 4 a.m, the sea was black. By 6, it was red. The invasion fleet stretched to the horizon, more than 5,000 ships moving in slow, shuddering rhythm. The channel boiled under them, cold and indifferent. From the decks, the men could see nothing but smoke and spray. The sky was low and bruised. Rain drifted sideways like dust. "Looks like the end of the world," someone muttered. "Nah," said another. "Just the start of ours." On every Higgins boat, soldiers huddled shoulder to shoulder, packs pressing into ribs, rifles clattering with each rise and drop. They were farmers, welders, students, men from Iowa, Texas, Pennsylvania, now reduced to the same smell of salt and fear. The sea was rough enough to remind them how fragile wood could be. Private Jack Hutchinson couldn't tell if it was dawn or just the ocean reflecting gray. He wiped his face with a trembling hand and glanced over the gunwale. All he could see were waves and other boats, hundreds of them, identical, anonymous, doomed. The engines roared, and the whole fleet began to move in formation, like an army of ghosts drifting toward land. The officers had told them, "By breakfast, you'll be in France." But no one had said what breakfast would look like. Inside the LCVPs, the noise was unbearable. The Higgins boats were never meant for comfort. Steel hinges groaned, bolts rattled, and the ramp in front flexed with every impact. Diesel fumes filled the air, mixing with the sour stench of fear. Men vomited into their helmets, into the sea, into their own laps, and nobody cared. Hutchinson felt the boat lurch as a wave hit broadside. A man next to him crossed himself 3 times. The sergeant shouted, "Keep your eyes on the horizon. It helps the stomach." But the horizon was hidden behind fog and gun smoke. Up ahead, destroyers opened fire, their barrels flashing through the mist. The first shells screamed toward the beaches, miles away. The sound rolled back across the fleet like thunder. For a moment, everyone cheered. It meant they weren't alone. Then came the smell, gunpowder and burning salt. The sky flickered orange. Someone whispered, "God help them on the shore." The orders had been clear. Omaha, Sector Charlie Red. Hit the sand. Go right, move inland. But from this far out, all the sectors looked the same, a wall of fog hiding the unknown. A corporal from the 1st Division leaned close to Hutchinson. "You think they'll be ready for us?" Hutchinson shook his head. "Doesn't matter. We're coming anyway." At 5:10 a.m., they began the final run. The coxswain throttled forward. The Higgins boat slammed through the chop, its flat bottom skidding over each wave. Bullets already stitched the water ahead, long silver trails skipping across the surface. "They see us," someone shouted. Tracer fire arced overhead. The first LCVP in the line exploded when a mortar found it. The blast threw water and bodies skyward. The next boat veered left, then right, then straight again. No time to mourn. The sea didn't allow pauses. 2 minutes, yelled the coxswain. The men gripped their rifles tighter. Faces pale under grime, eyes wide. Every training film, every pep talk vanished. There was only the weight of gear and the pounding of hearts. The boat rocked harder now, waves taller, closer to shore. From the beach came the roar of MG-42s, fast and merciless. The bullets chewed through the water like drills. Shards of spray hit their faces. Hutchinson thought, absurdly, it's raining sideways. 30 seconds. The coxswain looked back once. A quick glance, enough to register the fear he couldn't afford to feel. He yelled, "Hold tight. Ramp down on my call." The shoreline appeared, not sand, but chaos. Smoke, fire, craters. Bodies already floating in. The smell of cordite was everywhere, thick and metallic. Private Donnelly from Ohio clutched a photo in one hand, a girl in a summer dress, and tucked it inside his jacket. "She's waiting," he said, more to himself than anyone else. 10 seconds. The boat shuddered as it scraped the shallows. The noise turned inside out. Bullets on steel, engines screaming, men shouting prayers they didn't know they remembered. Ramp down. The gate dropped, and daylight poured in like violence. The first man stepped forward and disappeared. Water filled the boat waist deep. Blood mixed with it instantly. Hutchinson jumped, hit cold, and went under. His pack dragged him down until he tore the straps loose and surfaced gasping. The sound was a single, endless roar, surf, gunfire, screaming. Men flailed through the shallows, stumbling over bodies and barbed wire. The air stung like acid. A shell landed near enough to lift Hutchinson off his feet. He hit the ground again and crawled, clutching his rifle like a relic. Behind him, another Higgins boat opened its ramp, and another wave of men spilled out. The ocean was red now, not metaphorically, but literally, stained by the price of the morning. Hutchinson looked up toward the bluffs, saw flashes of gunfire, and thought, so this is what history looks like. He pushed forward, half swimming, half crawling. Around him, the survivors did the same. Nobody spoke. There wasn't time for words anymore. And somewhere, far behind them, more boats were coming. Hundreds more. Wooden coffins packed with the living. The sea kept delivering them, one after another, as if determined to prove that plywood and courage could invade a continent. The ramp dropped, and hell rushed in. It wasn't war anymore. It was weather, a storm made of metal, noise, and terror. The first Higgins boat slammed into the shallows of Omaha Beach just after 6:30 a.m. The sea hissed like it was alive. Machine guns tore through the air with the dry rhythm of typewriters from hell. The ramps fell open, and the men inside stepped into eternity. From 32 boats in the first wave, barely 11 made it close enough to touch land. The rest were shredded in the surf, caught by crossfire from the cliffs. MG-42s spat 1,200 rounds a minute, more bullets than seconds. Men sank before they ever saw France. One survivor wrote later. Private Hutchinson felt the water punch his chest like a fist. His pack dragged him under. The sound of the world turned into bubbles and screams. He kicked free, surfaced, and gasped. The air itself felt sharp, burned by gunpowder. Around him floated helmets, rifles, faces. He didn't know who was alive until they started crawling toward the beach. A man next to him shouted, "Get to cover," and was cut in half before the words finished. Another, already bleeding, tried to pull a buddy up by the straps of his gear, yelling, "Breathe, damn it." The sea just took them both. From the ramp of one Higgins boat, the coxswain shouted over the chaos, "Go, go, go." His craft had been hit twice, wood splintered and smoking, but he refused to back off. He turned the wheel, circling back through the fire to pick up survivors. When a shell tore through his side, he kept going until the engine died. Later, one of the Marines who saw it wrote, "I heard wood cracking like bones." Those boats had always looked fragile, plywood shells bolted with steel. But in that moment, they were the only bridge between sea and sand, between terror and purpose. Every few seconds, another one hit the beach. Some disintegrated on impact, others stuck fast and became shields for the men who followed. The sound never stopped. Bullets hissed through water, snapped against helmets, punched holes through ribs. The beach turned into a slaughterhouse of motion, men crawling, dragging, dying. Hutchinson found himself behind a metal obstacle shaped like a cross. He pressed his face into the wet sand, feeling each impact tremble through the ground. A sergeant shouted orders that no one could hear. When the man stood to point toward the bluff, a bullet took him clean through the throat. The tide kept rising. Bodies drifted back and forth like offerings. In the distance, a tank half buried in water fired blindly at the cliffs until its barrel jammed. Smoke rolled down from the hills, covering everything in a sickly gray. And still the boats kept coming. Each Higgins craft was numbered, painted dull gray, the same color as despair. Yet each carried 30 more souls who refused to stop. Crews steered through wreckage and corpses, their propellers chopping through waves thick with oil. The coxswains shouted encouragements that were drowned by explosions. The smell of diesel and blood became one thing. One sailor, no name recorded, turned his boat back 3 times under fire. The last time, the engine caught fire, and he jumped into the surf, swimming toward a soldier who couldn't move. Witnesses said he reached him, lifted him halfway out of the water, and then both vanished when a shell hit. The beach began to resemble a junkyard. Burned boats listed sideways. Others smoldered where they'd wedged against obstacles. Planks floated everywhere, pieces of plywood that had once been someone's lifeline. The men used them as cover, as rafts, as desperate armor. A medic crawled from one wreck to another, dragging morphine packs and muttering the Lord's Prayer between breaths. He stopped beside a shattered Higgins hull and found a man still alive beneath it, whispering something he couldn't hear. When he leaned closer, the soldier said, "Don't let them take the boat. She got us here." By mid-morning, the tide had carried the dead into neat rows without permission. Commanders on the ships watched through binoculars and didn't know what to call what they were seeing. It wasn't battle. It was sacrifice rendered in real time. And yet, amid the fire, something shifted. Small groups began to move forward, crawling, inching, throwing grenades into gun nests, one hill at a time. Each step cost blood. But each step came because those flimsy boats had done the impossible. They delivered an army straight into hell. When Hutchinson finally reached the base of the cliffs, he turned back once. The sea behind him looked like it was burning. Higgins' boats, torn, half-submerged, riddled with holes, still floated, still tried to land. The sight made no sense. It also made victory possible. In his field diary, recovered later, a single line stood out under mud and seawater stains. The boats never stopped coming. And that's what saved them. Not armor, not luck, not even strategy. Just plywood, engines, and men who refused to quit steering toward fire. They called them wooden coffins. But that morning, they were lifeboats of history, delivering humanity straight through the gates of hell. By noon, the sea turned calm, but only because there was no one left to fight it. The morning storm of fire had slowed to a grim rhythm. Smoke drifted in sheets over the beaches of Normandy, the color of ash and rain. The waves, once boiling with landing craft, now moved with a strange patience, rocking against wreckage and the dead. Helmets floated like black petals. Rifles stuck upright in the sand like gravestones. The survivors of the first waves lay pressed against the base of the cliffs, faces black with smoke, eyes hollow. Some still fired upward, not really aiming, just refusing to stop. Others crawled between the bodies, whispering names, dragging ammunition, or just staring at the horizon as if the sea might take them back. Hutchinson's hands were raw, blistered from salt and stone. His uniform clung to him like another skin. When he finally looked up, he saw a squad pushing forward, one grenade at a time, toward a pillbox carved into the rock. The sergeant, a man with no helmet and half a sleeve, crawled forward and shouted, "Cover me," before tossing a grenade into the dark mouth of the bunker. A flash, a roar, then silence. For the first time that day, it was the kind of silence that meant victory. Someone laughed, high-pitched and hysterical. Another joined in, then more. The laughter spread like fire in the wind. Not joy, just disbelief that anything could still be alive inside them. At the waterline, the second wave was landing. The Higgins boats came again, gray against the smoke, each one carrying reinforcements, medics, engineers, and ammunition. The ramps dropped into blood-colored surf. Men ran out, slipping, falling, rising again. They came back, Hutchinson would write later, over and over, like ghosts out of the smoke. The coxswains guided their battered boats through debris that had once been an army. They dodged burning hulks, pulled survivors from the surf, and kept running supplies to the beach. Some had been hit 3 or 4 times already. One LCVP, half full of holes, limped in with its bilge pumps roaring, its helmsman shouting, "One more run." The tide began to turn, literally and figuratively. Engineers blew gaps in the barbed wire. Riflemen climbed through. The cliff guns faltered under constant fire from offshore destroyers. Slowly, painfully, the impossible line began to move inland. From the command ship off the coast, officers watched through binoculars. What had looked like failure an hour earlier now looked like momentum. The radio crackled with the first clear words since dawn. "We've breached the wall. Repeat, we're through." On the beach, a medic crouched beside a dying man who was smiling for no reason he could explain. "We made it," the soldier said. "Tell them we made it." The medic just nodded, pressing a hand to his wound until the breathing stopped. All along the shore, Higgins' boats kept landing. The sound of their engines became a heartbeat, steady, relentless. They brought up ammunition, stretcher teams, water, morphine, flamethrowers, field radios, food. They carried out the wounded, the exhausted, and the dead. Their hulls were pocked with holes and soaked in diesel and blood, but they kept coming. By mid-afternoon, the tide was littered with everything an invasion needed and everything it had cost: crates of bullets, ration tins, shoes, pieces of uniform, and faces that would never see home again. Above it all, the wind carried the smell of oil and victory. When the German positions finally began to fall silent, the men on the beach didn't cheer right away. They just looked around at what was left, at the wrecked Higgins boats lying half buried in the sand, at the water that had turned from red back to blue. One of the engineers lit a cigarette with trembling hands and said, "We built a bridge made of boats and bodies." Another replied quietly, "Then let's make sure it holds." By nightfall, 156,000 Allied troops were on French soil. A continent had begun to turn, and yet, most of them never knew the name of the man who had made it possible. They never met Andrew Higgins, the builder from New Orleans whose wooden coffins had carried them through fire and into history. He wasn't on the beach that day. He didn't even carry a gun. But he had believed in an idea so simple it sounded impossible, that a piece of plywood and a good engine could deliver freedom. As dusk fell, the last returning Higgins boat limped out to sea, its hull shredded, its crew silent. Behind them, the beach they'd fed with blood was now crawling with life. Tents going up, stretchers laid out, flags rising in the wind. One sailor looked back toward the shore and said softly, "We left half our souls in that sand." The coxswain nodded, keeping his eyes forward. "Yeah," he said, "but the rest of us brought back the world." The tide washed over the hulls one last time, pulling them gently back toward the deep, those wooden coffins that had done the impossible. When Eisenhower was asked who won the war, he said, "Higgins did." But Andrew Jackson Higgins never fired a shot. His war was fought under fluorescent lights and factory roofs, with blueprints instead of maps, with welders and carpenters instead of soldiers. New Orleans, 1944. The city never slept anymore. The river smelled of oil, steel dust, and magnolias struggling to bloom against the smoke. At the edge of the Mississippi, the Higgins Industries shipyards pulsed like living things, sparks flying, hammers ringing, voices shouting over the roar of engines. The war was half a world away, but here, it felt closer than anywhere. Higgins walked the floor every night. No tie, sleeves rolled up, cigar in his teeth, clipboard under his arm. His hair was gray now, but his eyes were still restless, full of fight. He wasn't building boats anymore. He was building time itself. Every hour meant another craft, another chance for someone's son to live through the landing. He used to joke, "I fight my war with a stopwatch." But it wasn't really a joke. There were problems he couldn't outwork, shortages of wood, of steel, of labor. Washington buried him in forms, audits, inspections. Admirals complained about cost overruns. Senators questioned his temper. But no one could question his results. By the end of 1944, his factories had produced over 23,000 LCVPs, more than any other shipyard in the world. He fought his war in the factory. The work never stopped. The assembly line ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When the sirens sounded shift changes, the streets outside filled with men and women in grease-stained uniforms. At midnight, the air still throbbed with the rhythm of industry, welders' torches flickering against the dark like lightning trapped in cages. What made Higgins different wasn't just the speed. It was who he hired. He didn't care about color or gender, only competence. Black welders from Louisiana, white machinists from Ohio, Cajun carpenters, women from the French Quarter, they worked side by side, earning the same pay for the same job. When Washington warned him about mixing races, he wrote back, "I'm mixing patriots." One worker, a young woman named Lillian Price, later recalled, "In a way, we were fighting Hitler by proving him wrong, right there in Louisiana." The factory floor became its own front line. The roar of engines replaced artillery. Burned hands, smoke in the lungs, 12-hour shifts. Their casualties were exhaustion, not bullets. But the purpose was the same. Every plank of wood nailed, every engine tested, was a small act of defiance against tyranny. Higgins was never satisfied. He timed his workers with a stopwatch, scolded engineers for wasting bolts, and refused to take vacations. When the Navy requested 30 boats a week, he promised 50 and delivered 53. He demanded the impossible because the war demanded it of him. Once, during an inspection, a naval officer remarked that the boats looked too crude for combat. Higgins snapped, "They're not going to a dance, they're going to a damn war." He knew what the boats were: plywood coffins, fast, cheap, built to die so men could live. And still he pushed for more. At home, his wife would sometimes find him asleep at the kitchen table, blueprints spread around him, pencil still in hand. He'd wake with a start and mumble, "How many shipped today?" She'd tell him. He'd nod, write down a number, and fall asleep again. On June 6, 1944, when the reports from Normandy reached New Orleans, the factory stopped, just for a minute. The foreman gathered the workers, turned up the radio, and everyone listened in silence. The announcer's voice crackled. "Allied forces have landed in France." Someone started crying. Another shouted, "Those are ours. Our boats." The sound rolled through the factory like thunder. Higgins didn't join the cheering. He walked outside alone and looked at the river. The water reflected the glow of the city, restless and endless, carrying invisible echoes from across the ocean. He lit a cigar and said quietly, "Get back to work," because he knew the war wasn't over. Thousands of boats would still be needed for supplies, rescues, evacuations. Each one mattered. By 1945, the Allies were advancing across Europe, and Higgins' name had become legend among soldiers who never met him. They called his craft the boats that won the war. Eisenhower himself said it plainly. If Higgins had not designed and built those boats, we never could have landed over an open beach. He is the man who won the war for us. Higgins read that quote once, in a newspaper folded on his desk. He didn't frame it. He just circled the word boats and muttered, "They did the winning, not me." When victory finally came, the orders stopped. Factories slowed, then fell silent. The welders went home. The torches went dark. Higgins stood in the empty warehouse and listened to the ghosts of his machines, the hum that had carried freedom across the world. He didn't know it yet, but his name would fade, just like the boats he built. For now, he just picked up a splinter of wood from the floor, turned it in his hand, and said softly, "Not bad for a toy." They called them wooden coffins. But those coffins carried freedom. Now, the beaches are quiet. The wind moves across the dunes of Normandy, whispering through grass that grows where men once crawled through fire. The tide rolls in and out, steady, timeless, washing over fragments of history, a rusted helmet, a bullet casing, a piece of wood worn smooth by the sea. Every storm still uncovers something new. A nail, a hinge, a shattered plank stamped with a faded number, LCVP. What remains of the Higgins boats lies buried in the sand or half sunk in the tide pools, their plywood turned to salt and memory. An old fisherman near Vierville once said that after heavy rain, the ocean spits up ghosts. Sometimes he'd find the curve of a hull, the edge of a ramp, blackened by age but unmistakable. "They built those from wood," he said, "but they float in time better than steel." In the decades after the war, the world rebuilt itself and forgot how fragile victory had been. The soldiers who lived carried the memory quietly, like a scar under their shirts. When asked, they would smile, shake their heads, and say, "You had to be there." But in rare moments, on anniversaries, in interviews, over a drink, their voices softened. "Every time I smell salt and diesel," one veteran said, "I hear that ramp slam open again." For many, the sound never left. It lived somewhere deep inside them, the metallic thunder of courage meeting terror, the split second between obedience and survival. At one memorial gathering, a gray-haired man arrived with a small, rectangular piece of wood wrapped in cloth. He held it up for the crowd. "This," he said, "was my ticket to hell and back." It was a splinter from his Higgins boat, carved into a makeshift keepsake the day after D-Day. He had kept it on his desk for 50 years. Someone asked him why. He thought for a long moment, then replied, "Because I owe my life to something that was never supposed to last." He smiled faintly, running his thumb along the grain. "You see," he said, "we all thought we'd die in those boats. But somehow, they carried us. The water was full of fire and men screaming. But those planks, they just kept floating." It wasn't much, but it was enough. That's all you ever really need, something that floats. The veterans who survived the beaches aged, faded, and finally disappeared. Their stories became books, their faces bronze statues. But the boats, the plywood miracles that carried them, slipped quietly into the background of history. No one wrote songs about them. They weren't beautiful, or heroic, or even built to survive. They were tools, and then they were gone. Yet, for a brief moment in 1944, they were the most important machines on Earth. Each one was a bridge between continents, between fear and faith. They turned ordinary men into invaders, into liberators, into witnesses of history. In museums now, a few Higgins boats still exist. Their paint is chipped, their metal eaten by rust, their wood dark and cracked. Children climb inside during tours, laughing, pretending to drive. Guides explain that these boats carried men to the beaches on D-Day, that they changed the course of the world. The visitors nod, take photos, move on. But if you stand inside one long enough, if you let the silence settle, you can almost hear it breathe again. The slap of waves, the rattle of gear, the voice of a sergeant yelling over the wind, "Hold on, boys." Ramps going down. Across the ocean, in New Orleans, the Mississippi still runs past the old site of Higgins Industries. The factories are gone, replaced by parking lots and office buildings. But every June, a small group gathers by the river. They light candles, place a model LCVP in the water, and watch it drift downstream until the current takes it out of sight. A plaque nearby bears Eisenhower's words, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us." Most people walking by don't stop to read, but those who do tend to stay a while. The river, after all, looks a lot like the channel, brown, restless, eternal. Sometimes, at sunset, when the light hits the water just right, it glows gold for a few minutes, the same color as the dawn on June 6, 1944. If you close your eyes, you can almost imagine them again. Hundreds of wooden boats heading east, engines roaring, hearts pounding, the weight of history inside each fragile hull. The legacy isn't in the boats themselves, or even in the battles they carried. It's in the proof that something built from the simplest materials, wood, steel, sweat, and belief, could carry the weight of freedom across an ocean. Somewhere, beneath the surf, the last pieces of Higgins' boats still rest. They've turned dark as the seabed, almost part of it now. But if you look closely at low tide, you might see a sliver of plywood jutting from the sand, a line too straight to be natural. It doesn't look like much, just a forgotten scrap of the past. But to the men who once trusted their lives to it, it was everything. Without those boats, there would have been no beachhead. Without the beachhead, no liberation. And without liberation, no victory. Wooden coffins, yes. But inside them, a generation's courage and the idea that faith in an impossible design could change the world. Because sometimes, victory isn't built from armor or firepower. Sometimes it's built from wood and belief strong enough to float.